June 15th, 1944. 08:47 hours. Beach Red 2, Saipan, Mariana Islands. The Marine had been hit in the chest by machine gun fire, 3 rounds from a Japanese Nambu that had torn through his left lung and shattered 2 ribs. He was drowning in his own blood, gasping like a fish pulled from water, eyes wide with the terror of someone who knows they're dying. Around us, the beach was chaos, thousands of Marines pushing inland against Japanese defensive positions, artillery shells exploding, small arms fire crackling like burning kindling, wounded men screaming for help that seemed impossible to provide in this hell. My name is Pharmacist's Mate 2nd Class Robert Doc Harrison, United States Navy, and I was a conscientious objector who'd refused to carry weapons but volunteered to save lives instead. 22 years old, former pre-med student from Philadelphia, now a combat medic attached to the 2nd Marine Division with exactly 19 seconds to decide whether this Marine lived or died. Japanese military doctrine said I shouldn't exist, that men who wouldn't fight couldn't serve, that medical personnel who treated enemies showed weakness, that battlefield medicine was futile because warriors should accept death without complaint. They were about to learn that the Americans who saved lives were more dangerous than those who took them, that medical care that kept soldiers alive and fighting was a weapon they couldn't counter, and that my refusal to kill made me more valuable to the war effort than a dozen men with rifles. "Doc, help me!" The Marine's buddy was pressing both hands against the wounds, blood pulsing between his fingers with each heartbeat. "He's dying! Do something!" I dropped beside the wounded Marine, my medical kit already open, my hands moving through procedures I'd practiced 10,000 times in training, but never under fire. 19 seconds had become 12. His skin was gray, lips blue, pulse thready and irregular. He was in hemorrhagic shock from blood loss and pneumothorax from the collapsed lung. Without immediate intervention, he had maybe 2 minutes before his heart stopped. Japanese snipers were targeting medics specifically. We were marked with red crosses that should have granted protection under Geneva Convention, but instead made us priority targets. Their military philosophy held that Western concern for individual lives was weakness, that societies that spent resources saving wounded soldiers instead of sending more healthy ones showed moral decay. They killed medics to deny Americans medical care, thinking it would demoralize troops and reduce combat effectiveness. They failed to understand that watching medics risk their lives to save wounded Marines made those Marines fight harder, that knowing medical care was available made soldiers more willing to take calculated risks, that saving lives was more powerful than taking them for morale and combat effectiveness. But none of that philosophical understanding mattered in the 12 seconds I had before this Marine died. My hands moved automatically through the trauma protocol developed specifically for chest wounds. Seal the sucking chest wound with petroleum gauze to restore lung pressure. Establish IV access for fluid replacement. Inject morphine for shock management. Prepare for emergency evacuation. 8 seconds. The wound sealed, lung re-inflating, visible improvement in breathing. 6 seconds. IV established in his left arm, plasma flowing to replace lost blood volume. 4 seconds. Morphine administered, patient stabilizing, still critical but no longer actively dying. "Stretcher bearers," I yelled over the sound of combat. "Critical chest wound needs immediate evacuation." 2 Navy corpsmen appeared within seconds. We worked in coordinated teams, stretcher bearers positioned to respond immediately when medics called for evacuation. They loaded the wounded Marine with practiced efficiency, moving toward the beach where landing craft were already evacuating wounded to hospital ships offshore. That Marine would survive. He'd spend 6 weeks recovering on a hospital ship, another 3 months in stateside facilities, then return to duty.
He'd write home about the medic who saved his life under fire. He'd tell other Marines that medical care was available even in the worst combat. He'd contribute to the reputation that made American medical services the most effective combat multiplier in military history. And somewhere in Japanese headquarters, intelligence officers would note another example of inexplicable American battlefield behavior: wasting trained personnel as unarmed medics, expending resources to save wounded instead of replacing them, showing concern for individual lives that Japanese doctrine said proved Western weakness. They didn't understand that this weakness was winning the war, that American soldiers fought harder because they knew someone would save them if wounded, that Japanese soldiers grew demoralized watching enemies receive immediate medical care while their own wounded were expected to commit suicide rather than burden their units. The medics they mocked as too gentle for war were about to teach them that saving lives could be more devastating than taking them, that 97% wounded survival rates gave Americans an insurmountable manpower advantage, and that the soldiers they thought weak for caring about casualties were actually demonstrating the kind of strength that totalitarian societies could never match.
The journey from Philadelphia college student to Saipan combat medic had begun 18 months earlier, in January 1943, when I'd registered for the draft as a conscientious objector. The selective service officer had looked at my paperwork with barely concealed contempt. "You won't fight?" he'd asked flatly. "I'll serve," I'd replied. "I'll go wherever the military sends me. I'll face the same dangers as combat troops, but I won't carry weapons. I won't kill." Religious objection? Moral conviction. I'm studying to be a doctor. My purpose is saving lives, not taking them. The military needs medics as much as riflemen. Let me serve where I can do the most good. He'd stamped my papers and sent me to Navy Hospital Corps School at Great Lakes Naval Training Station. I'd expected harassment, discrimination, maybe outright hostility from military personnel who saw conscientious objectors as cowards hiding behind religious exemptions. Instead, I'd found respect. Medics were valued, their courage recognized, their role understood as essential to combat effectiveness. The training had been intense and comprehensive. We learned trauma medicine, surgical procedures, disease prevention, field sanitation, tropical medicine, and psychiatric care. We studied drug administration, wound treatment, fracture stabilization, triage protocols, and emergency procedures. Most importantly, we learned to work under conditions that would make civilian emergency rooms seem peaceful. Treating wounded while under fire, performing surgery in foxholes, evacuating casualties across terrain where every step might trigger landmines. "You're going to see things that will haunt you forever," our instructor, a veteran of Guadalcanal, had told us during the final week. Men with wounds that shouldn't be survivable. Kids your age dying in your arms despite everything you do. Marines screaming for their mothers while bleeding out. You'll want to quit, want to give up, want to let yourself be chilled just to escape the horror. Don't. Every man you save is a victory. Every wounded Marine you get back to his family is proof that this work matters. You're not soldiers. You're something more important. You're the reason soldiers can afford to be brave. Those words had sustained me through training, through the voyage across the Pacific, through the hell of amphibious assault where Marines died before they reached the beach and wounded men drowned in 3 feet of water because nobody could stop to help them. Now, 19 hours into the Saipan invasion, I'd already treated 43 wounded Marines. 39 would survive. 4 had died despite everything I could do. Wounds too severe, blood loss too extreme, organs too damaged. I remembered each one's face, each one's last words, each one's final moments. They'd haunt me forever, just as our instructor had promised. But I also remembered the 39 who lived because I was there, who'd go home to families, who'd live full lives after the war. The mathematics were brutal but simple. American medical services saved approximately 97% of wounded who reached medical care alive. Japanese medical services saved perhaps 30%. That 67-point difference meant American forces could sustain casualties that would cripple Japanese units, that American soldiers fought knowing wounds weren't death sentences, that Japanese soldiers grew demoralized watching their own wounded left to die, while American casualties received immediate, sophisticated care. The medics the Japanese mocked as evidence of Western weakness were providing America with a strategic advantage worth divisions of combat troops. The Japanese military philosophy toward medical care was shaped by centuries of samurai tradition and Bushido warrior code. Soldiers were expected to fight until death, to view wounds as shameful evidence of insufficient combat spirit, to commit suicide rather than accept capture or medical evacuation. The Imperial Japanese Army allocated minimal resources to medical services, viewed battlefield medicine as wasteful attention to those who'd failed as warriors, expected wounded soldiers to either heal themselves or die quietly without burdening their units. This philosophy was codified in official documents. The Shenjinkun military code issued in 1941 stated explicitly, "Do not suffer the shame of being taken prisoner alive. Die rather than face the dishonor of capture." Japanese field medical services were minimal, typically one physician per regiment of 3,000 men, with limited supplies, no evacuation system beyond manual carrying of wounded, and doctrine that discouraged medical attention for any but the most senior officers. A captured Japanese medical manual translated by American intelligence included guidance that shocked Western medical officers. Soldiers with severe wounds should be given means to commit honorable suicide if they request it. Units should not be delayed evacuating wounded who cannot walk. Priority medical attention should be reserved for officers and specialist personnel who can return to duty quickly. The contrast with American medical philosophy was absolute. U.S. military doctrine held that every soldier was valuable, that saving wounded was both moral obligation and tactical necessity, that comprehensive medical services multiplied combat effectiveness by enabling soldiers to take necessary risks knowing they'd receive care if wounded. The U.S. military in World War II would eventually employ approximately 600,000 medical personnel, about 4% of total forces, in roles ranging from frontline medics to hospital administrators, surgery specialists, to psychiatric care providers. Japanese commanders viewed this as wasteful allocation of manpower. American commanders viewed it as force multiplier that enabled aggressive tactics Japanese forces couldn't match. Both were right according to their own metrics, but American metrics included keeping soldiers alive, while Japanese metrics assumed soldiers were expendable. The battlefield results would prove which philosophy worked better in total war.
June 16, 1944. 13:20 hours, approximately 1,500 yards inland from Beach Red 2. The Marine platoon had walked into a Japanese ambush in dense jungle where visibility was measured in feet. Machine gun fire came from 3 directions simultaneously, pinning the Marines in a kill zone where movement meant death. 5 men were down in the first 30 seconds, 4 more in the next minute as they tried to maneuver. The platoon lieutenant was screaming for corpsmen, his voice raw with desperation. I was 200 yards away, attached to a different unit, when the call came over the radio net. Red 2, this is Red 6. We've got 9 urgent casualties in a hot LZ. Need corpsmen immediately. Grid coordinates, 459er, 273. The Marine captain commanding my unit looked at me. Harrison, can you reach them? 9 wounded Marines, all urgent, meaning they'd die within minutes without medical care. 200 yards through jungle where Japanese snipers had perfect concealment. I'd be moving toward active combat, not away from it. The probability of getting shot was high. The Geneva Convention prohibited attacking medical personnel, but the Japanese were targeting medics specifically, and nobody was enforcing international law in this jungle. I can reach them, sir. I need 2 stretcher bearers. You'll get 4, and a rifle squad for security. Move. We moved through jungle so thick that sunlight barely penetrated, following compass bearings toward coordinates where Marines were dying. The security squad spread out in tactical formation, weapons ready, every man knowing that protecting the medics was as important as engaging the enemy. Japanese snipers let us pass. They were targeting the Marines in the kill zone, not wanting to reveal their positions by shooting at rescuers. We reached the pinned platoon at 13:42 hours. The scene was worse than the radio calls suggested. 9 wounded had become 11. 2 more Marines hit while we were moving. Blood everywhere, men screaming, chaos that required immediate triage to separate those who could wait from those who die without immediate care. This was the moment that separated trained medics from theoretical students, making life or death decisions in seconds, allocating limited resources to maximum effect, accepting that saving 8 men might mean letting 1 die because you couldn't treat everyone simultaneously. Marine 1, sucking chest wound, conscious, stable for now, priority 3, stabilize and evacuate. Marine 2, abdominal wound with evisceration, unconscious, pulse weak, priority 1, immediate care or dies in minutes. Marine 3, compound leg fracture, severe bleeding, priority 2, stabilize bleeding, then evacuate. Marine 4, head wound, unconscious, irregular breathing, priority 1, immediate care. The triage continued through all 11 wounded in approximately 40 seconds. 3 priority 1 cases requiring immediate treatment, 5 priority 2 cases needing urgent care, 3 priority 3 cases stable enough to wait briefly. And Japanese machine guns still firing from multiple directions, rounds impacting nearby, combat continuing while I worked. Stretcher bearers, priority 1 first, abdominal and head wounds, move. My hands were already working on Marine 2, the abdominal wound case. Intestines exposed, massive bleeding from torn mesenteric arteries, patient in shock. This Marine would die in approximately 90 seconds without intervention. I had bandages, morphine, plasma, and training, but no surgery capability, no anesthesia, no way to repair internal damage properly. What I could do was stop the bleeding, treat the shock, and get him evacuated to a surgical team on the hospital ship. But that required keeping him alive for the next 30 minutes while stretcher bearers carried him 1,500 yards across Japanese-controlled jungle to the beach. The procedures I'd trained for took over, hands moving automatically through protocols that had become muscle memory. Pack the wound with pressure bandages, establish IV access, push plasma to maintain blood pressure, morphine for shock management, stabilization that gave this Marine maybe a 40% chance of surviving the next hour. Then move to Marine 4, the head wound, skull fracture, brain matter visible, breathing labored. This Marine had maybe a 10% survival chance even with perfect care. But that 10% meant he deserved every effort. Protect the wound, prevent infection, manage intracranial pressure, prepare for evacuation. 3 minutes of work that might make the difference between death and survival. Then Marine 3, the leg fracture, splint application, hemorrhage control, pain management. Then the priority 2 cases, who'd survive if they got care in the next hour. Then finally the priority 3 cases, who were stable enough to wait. At 14:27 hours, 45 minutes after we'd arrived, all 11 wounded Marines were stabilized and evacuated. 3 would die despite our efforts. The wounds were too severe, the damage too extensive, the golden hour of trauma care already expired before we'd reached them. 8 would survive and eventually return home because we'd reached them in time, applied proper trauma care, and got them evacuated to surgical facilities. The Marines who'd seen this, who'd watched medics run toward danger to save them, who'd witnessed immediate sophisticated medical care under fire, who'd observed teammates survive wounds that should have been fatal, would fight differently afterward. They'd take necessary tactical risks because they knew medical care was available. They'd trust their leaders because they'd seen evidence that individual lives mattered. They'd maintain morale through the worst combat because they'd witnessed proof that the military wouldn't abandon wounded soldiers. This was force multiplication through medical services, combat effectiveness enhanced not through firepower, but by demonstrating that soldiers' lives had value, that proper care was available, that wounds weren't necessarily death sentences. The Japanese had no equivalent system. Their wounded were left where they fell, expected to die quietly or commit suicide, treated as failures who had dishonored themselves by being wounded. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese soldiers fought desperately because wounds meant death, grew brittle in combat because they had no safety net, suffered morale collapse when they realized enemies received care while they were abandoned. The medical evacuation system that supported combat medics like me was a marvel of organization and logistics that Japanese forces couldn't match and never fully understood. The Americans had created a comprehensive chain of medical care extending from frontline corpsmen to stateside hospitals, each link designed to maximize wounded survival through rapid evacuation and sophisticated treatment. Battalion aid stations 200 to 400 yards behind front lines provided initial stabilization and triage. These mobile facilities had surgical capability for emergency procedures, blood transfusion equipment, and evacuation coordination. Collecting stations 1 to 2 miles behind lines, consolidated wounded for multiple battalions, provided additional surgical capability and prepared patients for movement to rear area hospitals. Hospital ships offshore provided full surgical facilities, including operating rooms, recovery wards, laboratory support, and specialist care. Wounded evacuated from beaches could be in surgery within 2 to 3 hours of injury. Rear area hospitals in Hawaii, Australia, and eventually Guam provided long-term care, specialized surgery, rehabilitation services, and psychiatric treatment. Stateside facilities received the most severely wounded for extended recovery, prosthetic fitting, and discharge processing. This system could move a Marine from frontline combat to stateside hospital in 72 hours if necessary. The evacuation speed, combined with sophisticated trauma care at each stage, explained the 97% survival rate for wounded who reached medical care alive. By comparison, Japanese medical evacuation basically didn't exist. Wounded soldiers who couldn't walk were left at frontline positions with maybe a medic who had minimal training and almost no supplies. The resource allocation reflected different philosophies. Americans dedicated approximately 600,000 personnel, 4% of total forces, to medical services. Japanese allocated perhaps 50,000, less than 1%. Americans viewed this as necessary investment in force preservation. Japanese viewed it as waste of combat power. The battlefield results spoke clearly. American forces could sustain casualty rates that would shatter Japanese units. American soldiers knew wounds weren't death sentences. Japanese soldiers knew wounds meant abandonment or death. The psychological impact was as decisive as the medical outcomes. June 23, 1944, Day 8 of the Saipan Battle. I'd treated 147 wounded Marines, lost 19 despite everything I could do, saved 128 who would have died without immediate care. I knew these numbers because I recorded every casualty, name, nature of wounds, treatment provided, evacuation status, ultimate outcome when known.
The Navy required detailed casualty reports, but I would have kept records anyway. Each number represented a person, a life saved or lost, a Marine who trusted me to keep them alive. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming. 8 days of combat, maybe 20 hours sleep total. Constant movement between casualty collection points and frontline positions. My medical supplies were running low. Morphine down to 12 syrettes, plasma down to 6 units, pressure bandages almost gone. But resupply was coming via landing craft that brought ammunition forward and carried wounded back. The psychological toll was worse. 19 Marines had died in my arms despite everything I knew, everything I'd been trained to do, every procedure I'd followed correctly. Their faces appeared when I tried to sleep. Their last words echoed in my mind. Their families would receive telegrams saying their sons died in combat, would never know that a medic had tried desperately to save them, would never hear how bravely they'd faced death. But 128 Marines were alive who'd otherwise be dead. 128 men who'd go home after the war, have families, live full lives. 128 families who'd get their sons back. That mathematics was supposed to provide comfort, supposed to balance the horror, supposed to justify the nightmares. It didn't. Nothing could balance watching young men die. Nothing could justify the waste of war. Nothing could make the horror acceptable. But continuing to work, continuing to save those who could be saved, continuing to provide care despite exhaustion and trauma, that was the only response I had. Doc, a Marine sergeant, appeared at my casualty collection point, his face showing the strain of 8 days continuous combat. Got a situation. There's a Japanese soldier in a shell crater about 200 yards forward. He's wounded, calling out. My men want to know what to do. This was the question that defined the moral center of American medical philosophy. Japanese soldiers had been instructed that Americans committed atrocities, that capture meant torture and death, that wounded Japanese should commit suicide rather than accept enemy medical care. Japanese forces routinely killed wounded Americans and targeted medics specifically. Showing mercy to Japanese wounded could be exploited, wounded soldiers used as bait for traps, apparently helpless enemies suddenly detonating grenades when Americans approached. But American military law was clear. Wounded enemies were to be treated according to Geneva Convention, provided with the same medical care as American casualties, protected from harm once disarmed and in custody. This wasn't just legal requirement, it was a moral principle that separated American forces from enemies who committed atrocities routinely. If he's genuinely wounded and disarmed, we treat him, same as we treat any Marine. That's the law, and that's what we do. He might have a grenade, might be a trap. Then approach carefully, verify he's disarmed, provide security. But if he's wounded and helpless, we give him medical care. That's what Americans do. The sergeant nodded and moved to organize a security team. I gathered medical supplies and followed, knowing this would be dangerous, knowing Japanese forces had used wounded as bait before, knowing that every Japanese soldier I saved was one more enemy who might kill Americans later, but also knowing that maintaining moral standards under impossible conditions was part of what made American forces different from enemies who'd abandoned civilization. We treated wounded enemies because it was right, because it demonstrated our values, because maintaining humanity in war meant sometimes showing mercy to those who'd shown none. The Japanese soldier was in his early 20s, maybe younger than me. Shrapnel wounds from an artillery strike had shattered his left leg and torn into his abdomen. He was conscious, terrified, expecting execution. When I approached with my medical kit instead of a weapon, his expression shifted from fear to confusion to something approaching disbelief. I treat wound, I said in broken Japanese, learned from a phrase book. You surrender, no kill. He didn't respond, just stared at me while I cleaned his wounds, applied bandages, splinted his leg, injected morphine for pain management. By American standards, his injuries were moderate priority too. He'd survive with proper care. By Japanese standards, he should have committed suicide already rather than accept the shame of capture and medical treatment from enemies. Why? Why help? He asked in English so broken I almost couldn't understand. Because you're wounded, because that's what we do. We evacuated him with American casualties, treated him in the same aid station, eventually shipped him to the same hospital facilities. He'd survive his wounds, spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp, eventually return to Japan with stories about Americans who gave medical care to enemies.
Those stories would contribute to gradually reducing Japanese willingness to fight to the death, would help convince Japanese soldiers that Americans didn't execute prisoners, would slowly undermine the propaganda that Americans were barbarians. This was psychological warfare through compassion, demonstrating that American values meant something, even under battlefield conditions, that our medical personnel would provide care, even to those who'd been killing us hours earlier, that we maintained moral standards our enemies had abandoned.
The Japanese commanders who'd mocked American medics as too gentle for war failed to understand that this gentleness was actually strength. Strength to maintain humanity in inhumane circumstances. Strength to show mercy even to enemies. Strength to uphold values even when doing so was dangerous and difficult. July 9, 1944. The battle for Saipan ended after 25 days of combat. American casualties, 16,525 killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese casualties, approximately 29,000 killed, with only 921 prisoners taken. A surrender rate of about 3%, demonstrating the effectiveness of Japanese propaganda that Americans executed prisoners. My personal statistics for the campaign: 318 wounded treated, 287 survived to evacuation, 31 died despite medical care. Survival rate, 90.25%, below the theater average of 97% because I was working in forward positions where wounds were often catastrophic before medics could reach casualties, but still high enough to prove that immediate combat medical care made enormous difference in survivability. The psychological cost was immeasurable. I'd seen things that would haunt me forever. Marines screaming for mothers while intestines spilled from abdominal wounds. Teenagers dying confused because they didn't understand why the pain wouldn't stop. Wounded men begging me to kill them because the agony was unbearable. I'd worked myself past exhaustion, past horror, past any normal limits of endurance. I'd maintained function through 25 days of continuous trauma by compartmentalizing emotions, suppressing reactions, focusing purely on mechanical procedures. Now, with the battle over, those compartments were breaking down. I'd find myself crying without reason. I'd startle at loud noises. I'd see wounded Marines in every shadow. Modern medicine would call it combat stress reaction or post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1944, we called it shell shock and mostly ignored it, expecting warriors to tough it out and resume normal function through willpower alone. The Navy recognized the problem, at least partially. They'd send combat medics to rear area facilities for recuperation, basically forcing us to rest, eat regular meals, sleep in actual beds, gradually decompress from combat trauma. The psychiatrists who debriefed us would later incorporate lessons into treating what would eventually be called PTSD, developing therapeutic techniques based on what they learned from men like me who had experienced the worst of battlefield trauma. You did well, the psychiatrist told me during my evaluation. 287 Marines are alive because of you. That's the number to focus on, not the 31 who died. I remember every one of the 31, I replied. Their names, their faces, their last words. I forget most of the 287. That's normal. Human psychology emphasizes failures over successes. Evolutionarily, remembering dangers and mistakes promoted survival better than remembering victories. But mathematically, logically, rationally, you saved far more than you lost. Focus on that truth, not your emotional reactions. It was good advice. I tried to follow it. The mathematics really were clear. 90.25% survival rate for casualties I treated, compared to perhaps 30% for Japanese wounded who received any care at all,
compared to nearly 100% fatality for Japanese wounded who received none. American medical philosophy was working exactly as designed, keeping soldiers alive and fighting at rates our enemies couldn't match. But mathematics couldn't eliminate the nightmares, couldn't stop the flashbacks, couldn't erase memories of young men dying in my arms. Combat trauma didn't follow rational rules. The mind wasn't a machine that could be reprogrammed by correct statistics. What eventually provided peace wasn't logic or statistics. It was reconnecting with the Marines I'd saved, receiving letters from recovered wounded thanking me for keeping them alive, learning that the men I'd treated were home with families, living full lives, having children who'd never exist if I hadn't been there in their father's darkest moments. Those letters became my therapy, tangible proof that the work mattered, that saving lives under impossible conditions was worthwhile, that the horror I'd experienced had produced outcomes worth the cost. The strategic impact of American medical superiority extended far beyond individual survival statistics. By mid-1944, American forces had developed such comprehensive medical care that soldiers fought with confidence that wounds wouldn't necessarily be fatal. This psychological factor enabled aggressive tactics that Japanese forces couldn't match. American soldiers would take calculated risks, would advance under fire, would expose themselves to accomplish missions, all because they trusted that excellent medical care was available if they got hit. Japanese soldiers fought with opposite psychology. They knew wounds meant abandonment or death, that medical care was minimal, that being wounded essentially ended their military service through death or permanent disability. This knowledge made them fight desperately when cornered, but also made them brittle under sustained pressure. Without hope of survival if wounded, they broke psychologically faster than troops who knew they'd receive care. The manpower implications were equally significant. American forces could return wounded soldiers to duty after recovery. Approximately 60% of wounded personnel eventually returned to active service after medical treatment and rehabilitation. Japanese forces essentially lost all wounded personnel permanently, either through death or disability. This meant American effective strength remained higher despite equal casualty rates. By 1945, American military medical capabilities had evolved to include comprehensive psychiatric care, rehabilitation services, prosthetic development, and long-term recovery support. The Veterans Administration hospital system would eventually provide lifetime medical care to disabled veterans. Japanese wounded received minimal care and were often reduced to begging on streets because their government provided no support for disabled veterans. This philosophical divide, American commitment to comprehensive care versus Japanese abandonment of wounded, reflected fundamental differences in how societies valued individual lives versus collective goals. Democratic societies that cared for wounded demonstrated that individual citizens mattered. Totalitarian societies that abandoned wounded demonstrated that citizens were expendable resources. The battlefield results validated the democratic approach overwhelmingly. August 15, 1945, VJ Day. I was aboard hospital ship USS Solace off Okinawa when news of Japanese surrender arrived. The war was over. The killing would stop. Wounded soldiers would no longer arrive in endless streams, requiring treatment under desperate conditions. Around me, medical personnel were celebrating, crying with relief, embracing each other. I stood quietly on the deck, watching the sun set over Okinawa, thinking about the journey from Philadelphia to this moment. I'd treated over 800 wounded men during 15 months of Pacific combat. I'd seen horrors that would haunt me forever, I'd worked under conditions that should have broken me. I'd maintained function through trauma that statistics said should have caused psychological collapse. But I'd also saved lives that would otherwise be lost. I'd proven that medical care under fire was possible and effective. I demonstrated that American commitment to preserving soldiers' lives was both moral imperative and tactical advantage. I'd contributed to wounded survival rates that exceeded anything previously achieved in warfare. The Japanese commanders who'd mocked American medics as too gentle for war had learned through systematic defeat that they'd misunderstood everything. Medical care wasn't weakness, it was force multiplier that enabled soldiers to fight harder knowing they'd receive care if wounded. Concern for individual lives wasn't more a weakness, it was societal strength that totalitarian enemies couldn't match. Refusing to abandon wounded wasn't tactical disadvantage, it was strategic superiority that kept American forces effective while Japanese forces broke under attrition. Most importantly, they'd learned that the medics who wouldn't carry weapons were among the most important personnel in modern warfare, that saving lives contributed more to victory than taking them, that 97% wounded survival rates provided America with manpower advantages Japan couldn't overcome, that systematic medical care was as decisive as firepower and logistics. I returned to the United States in September 1945 and was discharged with a Bronze Star for Valor and a Navy Commendation Medal for meritorious service. The citations mentioned treating hundreds of wounded under fire, performing life-saving procedures under combat conditions, risking death repeatedly to save others. They didn't mention the nightmares, the psychological trauma, the cost of witnessing horrors that civilian society couldn't imagine. I finished my medical degree at the University of Pennsylvania, became a trauma surgeon, and spent 40 years treating emergency cases in Philadelphia hospitals. The skills I'd learned as a combat medic translated directly to civilian emergency medicine. The psychological resilience I developed treating wounded under fire helped me function through decades of emergency room trauma. But I never forgot those 15 months in the Pacific, never stopped thinking about the 800 wounded men I'd treated, never stopped remembering the faces of those I'd saved and those who died despite my efforts. Combat medics carried burdens civilians couldn't understand. We'd seen humanity at its worst and best, witnessed what war did to young men's bodies, learned that saving lives was possible even in hell.
The Japanese commanders who'd mocked us as too gentle for war had fundamentally misunderstood what strength meant. Real strength wasn't refusing to show mercy. It was maintaining humanity under conditions that destroyed humanity. Real courage wasn't accepting death stoically. It was fighting to preserve life even when death seemed certain. Real victory wasn't killing more enemies. It was saving more friends. American combat medics in World War II saved approximately 1,750,000 wounded soldiers who would have died in previous wars. 97% survival rate applied to total wounded, producing outcomes that redefined what was possible in battlefield medicine. That wasn't weakness or gentleness. That was strength applied to its highest purpose, preserving human life even in warfare's worst circumstances. The statistical record of American military medical services in World War II tells a story of revolutionary capability deployed at industrial scale. Personnel and organization. Total medical personnel, approximately 600,000, 4% of total forces. Navy Hospital Corpsmen, combat medics, 73,500. Army medics and aid men, 85,000. Nurses, 76,000 plus, including 17,000 overseas. Doctors, 47,000 plus, 31,000 Army, 16,000 Navy. Psychiatrists and mental health specialists, 2,400.
Hospital support staff, 350,000 plus. Medical infrastructure, hospital ships, 15 dedicated vessels with surgical facilities. Mobile surgical hospitals, 67 units deployable to forward areas. General hospitals, 198 facilities worldwide, range from 500 to 3,000 beds each. Station hospitals, over 500 smaller facilities. Convalescent centers, 45 major facilities for rehabilitation. Medical evacuation system, average time wounded to surgery, 4 to 6 hours in the Pacific, 2 to 3 hours in Europe. Hospital ship capacity, 500 to 700 patients per vessel. Air evacuation missions, over 1 million patients moved by aircraft. Ground evacuation, coordinated ambulance networks in all theaters. Casualty processing speed, 2 to 3 days frontline to rear hospital typical. Treatment outcomes, overall wounded survival rate, 97.0% for those reaching medical care alive. World War I wounded survival rate, for comparison, 92.1%. Civil War wounded survival rate, 73.6%. Infection rate, reduced from 70% during World War I to less than 1% in World War II through antibiotics. Limb salvage rate, 85% versus 60% in World War I through improved surgical techniques. Return to duty rate, 60% of wounded eventually return to active service. Comparative statistics, Japanese wounded survival rate, estimated 30 to 40%, limited data. German wounded survival rate, approximately 75 to 80%, Western Front. Soviet wounded survival rate, estimated 50 to 60%, limited medical infrastructure. American medical personnel ratio, 1 medic per 16 combat troops. Japanese medical personnel ratio, 1 medic per 150 to 200 combat troops. Innovation and development, penicillin production, scaled from experimental to millions of doses. Blood plasma program, 13 million units collected and distributed. Whole blood transfusion, airshipped to forward areas within 48 hours. Sulfa drugs, standard issue for all medical personnel. Psychiatric care, first war with systematic mental health treatment. Rehabilitation services, comprehensive physical therapy and prosthetic programs. Psychological impact, American soldiers' combat effectiveness increased by confidence in medical care. Enemy morale impact, Japanese and German troops demoralized by medical disparity. Surrender rates, improved enemy surrender rates after witnessing American medical care. Home front morale, families' confidence soldiers received best care possible.
Long-term veteran support, foundation for modern VA medical system. In 1990, 45 years after the war ended, the Navy Hospital Corps Association held a reunion for combat medics who'd served in the Pacific. Over 2,000 former corpsmen attended, most in their 70s, gathering to share memories and honor comrades who died serving. I attended with reluctance. Decades of civilian life had helped me process the trauma, but returning to those memories still brought nightmares. Standing in the convention hall, surrounded by men who'd shared the same experiences, I realized we carried common burdens that nobody outside our community could fully understand. The keynote speaker was Admiral Joseph K. Taussig Jr., former Navy Surgeon General, who'd compiled comprehensive statistics on combat medical operations. Gentlemen, the work you performed under impossible conditions saved 1.75 million American lives that would have been lost in previous wars. The 97% survival rate you achieved represented a revolution in battlefield medicine that has never been exceeded. Your courage in treating wounded while under fire, your skill in performing procedures under conditions that made civilian emergency rooms seem peaceful, your dedication to saving lives regardless of personal risk. This represents the highest achievement of military medical services in human history. He paused, looking across the room at men who'd aged but still carried themselves with the bearing of those who'd faced death repeatedly. The Japanese commanders mocked you as evidence of American weakness.
They said concern for wounded soldiers demonstrated moral decay. They believed societies that spent resources saving casualties instead of sending more healthy troops were doomed to defeat. They were catastrophically wrong. Your work, saving lives, maintaining unit morale, enabling soldiers to fight knowing they'd receive care, was as decisive as any combat operation. You didn't just treat wounded soldiers, you provided strategic advantage that our enemies couldn't match and never understood until too late. The room erupted in applause that lasted for 5 minutes. These were men who'd spent decades since the war downplaying their service, telling people they'd just been medics, minimizing the courage required to run toward danger unarmed. Finally, someone with authority was telling them what they'd always deserved to hear. Their work had been essential, their courage had been real, their contributions had been decisive. During the social hour afterward, I met Lieutenant Patterson, the Marine whose life I'd saved on Saipan's Beach Red 2 46 years ago. He was 73 years old, retired from a career as a high school teacher with 4 children and 9 grandchildren. "Doc Harrison," he said quietly, gripping my hand. "I've wanted to thank you for 46 years. You saved my life on that beach. Those 19 seconds you spent keeping me alive, they gave me a wife, children, grandchildren, a whole life I wouldn't have had. How do you thank someone for giving you everything?" I couldn't speak. This was why the work had mattered. Not abstract statistics about survival rates or strategic advantage, but this man standing before me, alive because I'd been there in his darkest moment. His family existed because of 19 seconds of trauma care under fire. "You would have done the same for me," I finally managed. "Maybe, but you actually did it. You ran toward danger to save me. You risked your life for mine. That's not something I can ever repay." Throughout the reunion, I met dozens of men whose lives I'd saved, Marines whose wounds I had treated, soldiers I'd evacuated, casualties I'd stabilized. Each had stories about families, careers, lives lived fully because a medic had kept them alive long enough to reach surgical care. Those conversations finally gave me peace about the 19 Marines who died despite my efforts on Saipan. I'd saved 287 out of 306, a 93.8% survival rate that exceeded theater averages. The 19 who died had wounds too severe for any medic to treat successfully. I'd done everything possible, followed every procedure correctly, given maximum effort. Sometimes maximum effort wasn't enough, but that didn't diminish the 287 who lived. The mathematics I'd struggled to accept for 46 years finally made emotional sense. Saving 287 lives was an achievement worth celebrating, not a failure defined by the 19 I couldn't save. Every man at that reunion, every veteran whose life had been saved by combat medics, was proof that our work had mattered profoundly. The legacy of World War II combat medical services extends directly to modern military and civilian medicine. Every trauma protocol, every emergency procedure, every rapid response system traces roots to methods developed by American military medical services between 1941 and 1945. The concept of golden hour, that trauma survival depends on receiving definitive care within 60 minutes of injury, emerged from analyzing World War II casualty data. Modern emergency medical systems organize around this principle, pioneered by combat medics who learned that rapid treatment mattered more than perfect treatment. Triage procedures, systematically categorizing casualties by urgency to allocate limited resources optimally, were refined during the war. Modern emergency rooms, disaster response teams, and mass casualty protocols use triage methods by medics who had to choose which wounded to treat first when everyone needed immediate care. The blood plasma program that enabled forward transfusions revolutionized trauma care. Modern blood banks, donation systems, and emergency transfusion protocols
descend directly from the program that collected 13 million units of plasma for military use. Antibiotic use in trauma care, particularly penicillin for preventing infection, represented medicine's first widespread deployment of these revolutionary drugs. The protocols developed for combat use became templates for civilian antibiotic therapy. Psychiatric care for combat trauma laid foundations for modern PTSD treatment. The recognition that psychological wounds were real injuries requiring professional treatment rather than character weakness requiring discipline emerged from combat stress reactions treated in World War II medical experience. Rehabilitation services for amputees and disabled veterans created comprehensive programs that became models for civilian disability services. The prosthetics, physical therapy, and vocational rehabilitation developed for wounded veterans established standards that civilian medicine later adopted. Most fundamentally, the principle that every life deserves maximum effort to save, that medical care should be provided regardless of injury severity, social status, or ability to pay, became embedded in American medical ethics, partly through military medical service that treated every wounded soldier with equal dedication. The combat medics of World War II weren't just treating casualties. They were pioneering methods that would revolutionize all emergency medicine, demonstrating that systematic care could achieve survival rates previously impossible, proving that maintaining humanity while facing horror was both possible and essential.
The Japanese commanders who mocked American medics as too gentle for war learned through systematic defeat that they'd fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern warfare. Military effectiveness in total war didn't depend primarily on individual warrior spirit or willingness to accept death. It depended on systematic organization, comprehensive logistics, and proper utilization of all societal resources, including medical services that kept soldiers alive and fighting. Japanese philosophy that wounded soldiers should commit suicide rather than burden their units was revealed as strategic stupidity, not warrior virtue. Every wounded soldier abandoned represented trained personnel permanently lost. Every soldier who knew wounds meant abandonment fought with desperation born of having no alternative. Every unit that couldn't maintain strength through medical care grew weaker with each engagement. American philosophy that every wounded soldier deserved maximum effort to save produced opposite effects. Wounded personnel often returned to duty after recovery, maintaining unit strength. Soldiers fought confidently knowing medical care was available, enabling calculated risks that desperate troops couldn't take. Units maintained effectiveness through sustained operations because medical services preserved manpower. The 67-point difference in wounded survival rates, 97% American versus 30% Japanese, represented insurmountable strategic advantage. Applied across millions of casualties, this difference meant American forces could sustain operations that would shatter Japanese units, could maintain combat effectiveness despite equivalent casualty rates, could win through attrition that enemy forces couldn't survive. The medics who wouldn't carry weapons proved more valuable than many soldiers who did. Saving lives preserved manpower. Demonstrating concern for individuals maintained morale. Showing that American values meant something even in war's worst moments provided psychological strength that enemies lacked. In the end, the Japanese assessment was exactly backward. American medics weren't too gentle for war. They were too strong for enemies who mistook brutality for strength, who confused abandoning wounded with martial virtue, who believed totalitarian discipline could overcome democratic care for human life. The statistics proved which philosophy worked better. 97% American wounded survival versus 30% Japanese. 1.75 million American lives saved versus perhaps 150,000 Japanese. 60% return to duty rate versus near-zero Japanese. Force preservation versus force consumption. Victory versus defeat. The medics the enemy mocked saved more American lives than any other single military specialty. They provided strategic advantage through compassion. They demonstrated that strength could mean preserving life rather than taking it. They proved that the gentle approach to warfare, caring for wounded, maintaining medical ethics, upholding human values even in combat, was actually the approach that won wars when applied systematically at industrial scale. I'm 97 years old now, one of the few surviving Navy corpsmen who served throughout the Pacific War. Most of my brothers in arms are gone. The 73,500 hospital corpsmen who served, the thousands who died in combat, the tens of thousands who've passed in the decades since. Sometimes young military medics visit, asking about the war, wanting to know what combat medicine was really like. I tell them the truth. It's the hardest work you'll ever do, the most important work you'll ever do, and work that will haunt you forever, while also giving you purpose nothing else can match. I tell them about the 800 wounded I treated, the 750 who survived, the 50 who didn't despite everything I knew and everything I did. I tell them about 19 seconds on a Saipan beach that saved a Marine's life and gave him 46 years with family he wouldn't have had otherwise. I tell them about treating enemy wounded while under fire, because maintaining moral standards mattered even when enemies had abandoned theirs. Most importantly, I tell them that being a combat medic means carrying weapons of healing rather than destruction, means running toward danger when everyone else runs away, means maintaining humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. That this work is harder than carrying rifles, requires more courage than attacking enemies, demands more strength than any combat operation. The Japanese mocked us as too gentle for war. They were wrong. We were strong enough to show mercy while they could only show cruelty. We were brave enough to save lives while they could only take them. We were victorious while they were defeated. That's the legacy of American combat medics in World War II. We saved 1.75 million lives that would have been lost in previous wars, achieved survival rates that seemed impossible, proved that caring for human life was strength rather than weakness, demonstrated that democratic values could prevail even in warfare's worst circumstances. The medics they said would break became the ones who wouldn't. We bent under the weight of horror, but we never broke. We carried wounded to safety, brought hope to desperate moments, maintained light in darkness. We were unarmed warriors whose weapons were bandages and morphine, whose victories were measured in lives saved rather than enemies killed.
In the end, we proved that saving lives was more powerful than taking them, that 97% wounded survival was more decisive than any kill ratio, that the gentle approach to war was actually the approach that won. The Japanese were right that we were different from them. They just never understood that our difference was our strength.